The Billionaire's Unexpected Heir, Chapter 1, The Proposal. Alexander Wolfe sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table in the boardroom of Wolfe Industries. The air was thick with tension as the board members exchanged knowing glances. They had gathered to discuss quarterly profits and strategic expansions, but as usual, the topic had veered towards his personal life. Alexander, securing an heir is not just about your legacy, his CFO, Jonathan Pierce, stated. Investors want to see stability. A successor. Alexander clenched his jaw. He was only 35, yet the pressure to marry and produce an heir had hounded him since he took over his late father's empire. He had once believed in love. That was before betrayal taught him otherwise. Now he trusted no one, not the women who threw themselves at him, nor the business partners who smiled while planning his downfall. "I don't have time for relationships," Alexander said, his voice cold. "And I refuse to marry for convenience." His lawyer, Richard Alcott, adjusted his glasses. "Then consider surrogacy, a private arrangement, no strings attached." The room fell silent. Alexander's steel-gray eyes darkened. He had considered the idea before, but dismissed it. The thought of a child being raised by an opportunistic woman repulsed him. "What if the surrogate tries to claim the child later?" he asked. "Well, ensure she signs a rock-solid contract," Richard assured him. "Shall have no rights," Alexander exhaled slowly. He despised complications, but if this was the only way to secure his legacy, so be it. "Find the agency," he ordered, "and make sure she's completely anonymous." Elena Carter wiped her forehead, exhaustion weighing on her as she worked the evening shift at Levine's diner. At 22, she had learned to survive on little sleep and even less hope. Ever since her parents died in a car accident 2 years ago, she had been the sole guardian of her younger siblings, 15-year-old Emily and 10-year-old Noah. Bills kept piling up, and despite working 3 jobs, it was never enough. They were on the verge of eviction. "Elena, table 4 needs a refill," her boss called. She grabbed the coffee pot and forced a smile, serving an elderly couple. As she turned back, her best friend and coworker Maggie nudged her. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "Because I haven't," Elena muttered. Maggie hesitated before pulling out a flyer from her pocket. "I heard about this. It's kind of crazy, but it pays a fortune." Elena took the paper, reading the words aloud. "Confidential surrogacy opportunity, high compensation, no parental rights." Her pulse quickened. "This is insane," she whispered. "I know," Maggie admitted. "But you need money, and they're offering $500,000. $500,000. That could change everything. Emily could go to college. Noah wouldn't have to worry about where their next meal came from." Elena bit her lip. Could she really carry a stranger's child? A week later, Elena sat in a pristine office, her hands trembling as she signed the surrogacy contract. Dr. Reynolds, the clinic specialist, smiled reassuringly. "The biological father prefers anonymity. You'll never meet him, and once you deliver, the child will be his. No contact after that." Elena nodded, her heart hammering. As she left the clinic, she placed a protective hand over her stomach. She wasn't pregnant yet, but for the first time in years, there was hope. 1 month later, Elena sat on the examination table, her fingers gripping the paper sheet beneath her. The room smelled of antiseptic, and the ultrasound technician, a kind woman named Linda, studied the screen with widening eyes. Miss Carter, have you had any symptoms? Morning sickness? Fatigue?" "All of the above," Elena admitted. Linda turned the screen toward her, and what Elena saw nearly knocked the breath out of her. 4. 4 tiny heartbeats flickered on the screen. "You're carrying quadruplets," Linda announced. Elena's world spun. Meanwhile, Alexander's assistant, Benjamin Scott, hesitated before placing a file on his boss's desk. "The surrogate has undergone her first scan," he said. "There's an unexpected development." Alexander opened the folder and froze. 4 heartbeats. His expression darkened. "How the hell did this happen?" Benjamin adjusted his tie. "Dr. Reynolds assured us it was a single embryo transfer, but sometimes nature surprises us." Alexander clenched his fists. This complicated everything. He had planned for 1 heir, not 4. "Find the surrogate," he ordered. "I want to meet her." Elena was exhausted after another long shift at the diner when she stepped out into the night. A sleek black car idled at the curb. "Elena Carter?" a man in a suit asked. She froze. "Who's asking?" "The father of your children wishes to meet you." Elena's stomach dropped. This wasn't supposed to happen. Before she could protest, the door opened, revealing Alexander Wolfe. His presence was overwhelming. Broad shoulders, piercing gray eyes, and an aura of authority. "Get in," he ordered. Elena hesitated, but something in his eyes, a mix of anger and curiosity, made her comply. Inside, the air was thick with tension. "I didn't agree to meet you," she said, crossing her arms. "I don't care," Alexander replied smoothly. "You're carrying my children. That changes everything." His voice was deep, commanding, but Elena refused to be intimidated. "I signed a contract," she reminded him. "No contact, no interference." Alexander's gaze darkened. That contract didn't account for 4 babies. A lump formed in her throat. She knew this was unexpected, but what did he want? "What are you saying?" she whispered. He leaned in slightly. "You will move into my estate, effective immediately." Elena's breath caught. "Excuse me? I won't risk my children's health. You will be taken care of. In return, you follow my rules." Elena's heart pounded. She had fought all her life to be independent, but right now her choices were limited. She had 2 younger siblings depending on her. She had 4 lives growing inside her, and in front of her sat a billionaire who refused to take no for an answer. With no other options, Elena realized she was walking into a world where power, wealth, and control ruled everything. Would she survive it, or would she lose herself in the process? Chapter 2: The Billionaire's Rules. Elena stood in front of the grand Wolfe estate, her stomach twisting in nervous knots. The towering mansion was nothing like the cramped apartment she shared with Emily and Noah. It was cold, pristine, and overwhelming, just like the man who owned it. The limousine ride had been silent and tense, with Alexander barely glancing at her as he made phone calls. Now, standing before the massive wrought iron gates, she felt out of place. The butler, an older gentleman named Harris, opened the doors, his expression neutral. "Miss Carter," he greeted, stepping aside. "Mr. Wolfe is expecting you." She stepped into a marble foyer so vast it could fit her entire apartment 3 times over. The chandelier overhead shimmered like something out of a palace, and the air smelled of polished wood and money. Her worn-out sneakers squeaked against the marble floor. "I don't belong here." Alexander stood at the base of a grand staircase, dressed in a tailored suit that looked as if it cost more than she made in a year. "You're late," he stated, his gray eyes assessing her. Elena's temper flared. "You gave me no choice but to come here, so forgive me if I didn't pack my bags immediately." His lips twitched as if he were amused, but his expression remained unreadable. "Let's get one thing clear," he said, his tone sharp. "This isn't a negotiation. You are carrying my children, which means their health and well-being come first. You will stay here under my protection until they are born. If you have any objections, I suggest you leave now and face the consequences of breaking the contract." Elena swallowed hard. She knew she couldn't leave, not when her siblings depended on her. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "But I have rules too." Alexander arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Is that so?" She squared her shoulders. "I want Emily and Noah to stay with me. I won't abandon them just because I'm here." For the first time, Alexander's expression softened, just slightly. "Done." She blinked. "Wait, really?" He gave a slight nod. "They are your family. I will ensure they have everything they need." Elena hadn't expected him to agree so easily. A tiny part of her, one she refused to acknowledge, felt grateful. Later that evening, a maid named Rosalie led Elena to her room, a massive suite larger than her entire apartment. A king-sized bed, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, a walk-in closet filled with designer clothes. "This can't be real," Elena muttered, running her fingers along the silk bedsheets. "If you need anything, Miss Carter, just ask," Rosalie said with a kind smile before leaving. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, staring down at her simple jeans and faded hoodie. She felt like a misfit in a billionaire's world. A knock at the door made her jump. Alexander stepped inside, his presence commanding, even in the dim light. "I assume you're settling in?" She folded her arms. "This is all unnecessary. I don't need fancy clothes or a palace to live in." His lips curled into the barest smirk. "You're carrying 4 heirs to my empire. You'll live in comfort whether you like it or not." Elena scoffed. "So what now? Do I get a list of rules to follow?" "Yes," he said, handing her a folder. "These are your new daily schedules. Doctor's appointments, nutrition plans, security protocols. I don't take risks when it comes to my children." Elena opened the file and frowned. "You're kidding me. A 9 p.m. curfew? Limited phone access? A personal security detail? Alexander's gaze darkened. You're under my care, and I won't tolerate anything that puts the babies at risk. Elena narrowed her eyes. Impregnant, not a prisoner. His jaw tightened. Until the babies are born, this is non-negotiable. Elena clenched her fists. This was going to be a long, unbearable stay. The next morning, Elena decided to test how much freedom she actually had. After breakfast, she wandered into the vast gardens, inhaling the fresh ocean breeze. The estate grounds were breathtaking. Rose bushes, fountains, a private beach. For a moment, she allowed herself to enjoy the serenity. But as soon as she stepped near the gates, a deep voice broke the peace. Going somewhere? She turned to see Alexander standing behind her, hands in his pockets. Just getting some air, she replied. You don't leave the estate alone, he said, his tone firm. Her temper flared. You seriously have me on house arrest? For your safety, he countered. And for the babies. Elena crossed her arms. You can't control every second of my life. Alexander took a step closer, his intensity unnerving, yet strangely mesmerizing. You're carrying my children, Elena, he said in a low, authoritative voice. That makes your safety my concern. Whether you like it or not. Elena's heart pounded. Why did his possessiveness send shivers down her spine? Fine, she muttered, but I'm not a porcelain doll. I can take care of myself. Alexander smirked. Well, see about that. She turned away, her mind racing. What had she gotten herself into? That evening, Elena found Noah sitting alone in the library, flipping through a book. Hey, buddy, she said, ruffling his hair. What are you up to? Before he could answer, Alexander entered the room. Noah's eyes widened. Whoa, you're really tall. Tall. Elena stifled a laugh as Alexander raised an eyebrow. I suppose I am. Noah, ever the fearless one, continued. Are you going to be mean to my sister? Elena gasped. Noah. But Alexander surprised her. Instead of looking offended, he crouched down to Noah's level. I may be strict, he said, but I'll make sure your sister is safe. And you too. Noah considered this, then grinned. Okay, you seem kinda cool. Elena stared, completely thrown off. Was this the same cold billionaire she had argued with earlier? For the first time since she arrived, she saw something in Alexander's eyes that wasn't just control. It was something softer. Later that night, Elena sat on the balcony, gazing at the city lights. Alexander's world was so different from hers. She didn't belong here. She heard footsteps behind her. You're adjusting well, Alexander remarked. She sighed. If that's what you want to call it. He studied her. You're different from what I expected. Elena turned to face him. And what did you expect? A woman who'd quietly obey all your rules? His smirk was infuriating. Something like that. Elena rolled her eyes. Sorry to disappoint. A shadow passed over his face. You should know something, Elena. People will try to use you, manipulate you because of your connection to me. Be careful who you trust. A chill ran down her spine. Is that a threat? She whispered. Alexander's eyes darkened. It's a warning. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. Chapter 3. The walls begin to crack. The morning started peacefully, until it didn't. Elena had just finished breakfast with Noah and Emily when a sudden sharp pain shot through her abdomen. She gasped, clutching her belly as a wave of nausea and dizziness washed over her. Emily's eyes widened in panic. Elena? What's wrong? I don't know, Elena whispered, her breathing unsteady. The pain was different from the usual morning sickness. Before she could say anything else, her vision blurred. The next thing she knew, she was being lifted into strong arms. Stay with me, a deep voice commanded. Alexander. Elena felt his presence before she even opened her eyes. His grip was firm, yet gentle. And for the first time, she didn't feel like just a surrogate. She felt protected. Call the doctor, Alexander barked at Harris as he carried her toward the private medical wing of his estate. Elena wanted to argue that she didn't need to be carried, but her body betrayed her. Instead, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Why did that sound feel so safe? When Elena woke, she was in a luxurious bedroom she had never seen before. The room was dimly lit and the scent of fresh linen surrounded her. Finally awake? She turned her head to see Alexander sitting in a chair beside her bed, arms crossed, his usual intense gaze pinned on her. Elena blinked. Was he watching over her? What happened? She asked groggily. The doctor said you were dehydrated and stressed. His jaw tightened. You should have told someone. Elena scoffed. I didn't realize I needed a babysitter. Alexander stood, his frustration evident. "You're carrying 4 of my children, Elena. Your health is not something to gamble with." She sat up, ignoring the lingering dizziness. "I've taken care of myself my whole life. I don't need you controlling me." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't control, it's responsibility." For a moment, neither spoke. And then, in a moment of unexpected tenderness, Alexander reached out, his hand brushing against hers. Elena stiffened, her heart hammering. "You may not want my protection," he said softly, "but you have it, whether you like it or not." Her breath hitched. Why did those words send warmth through her chest? She should hate him. But at that moment, she didn't. Later that night, Elena woke up to the sound of soft murmuring. She turned toward the balcony where Alexander stood, speaking on the phone. His posture was tense, his free hand clenched into a fist. "No, I won't tolerate any security breaches," he said coldly. "Vincent Blackwood has already tried interfering. If he makes another move, I want to know immediately." Elena's stomach dropped. Vincent Blackwood? She had overheard his name before, a ruthless businessman and Alexander's rival. Was he a threat to the babies? Alexander ended the call and turned, his gaze locking onto her. "You should be resting." Elena hesitated before asking, "What's going on?" He studied her for a long moment before sighing. "Blackwood wants to challenge the surrogacy contract," Alexander admitted. "He's looking for a loophole to take the children from me." Elena's blood ran cold. "But why?" Alexander's expression darkened. "Because a Wolfe heir is worth billions, and with 4 of them." He trailed off, his meaning clear. Elena shivered. She had unknowingly stepped into a world where power dictated everything. She took a deep breath. "What happens if he wins?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "He won't." The way he said it, with absolute certainty, sent a chill down her spine. And for the first time, Elena realized just how far Alexander Wolfe would go to protect his own, including her. A few days later, Elena was feeling stronger. The scare had shifted something between her and Alexander. There was still tension, still stubbornness on both sides, but something was different. It became clear during one particular afternoon. Elena sat in the estate's garden, flipping through a baby book, when Alexander approached. He stood there for a moment, watching her. Finally, he sat beside her. "You're reading about pregnancy?" he asked, glancing at the book. Elena shrugged. "I figured if I'm carrying 4 babies, I should at least know what I'm doing." Alexander smirked. "And what have you learned?" She shot him a look. "That your kids are making me crave peanut butter and pickles, and it's all your fault." To her shock, Alexander laughed. Not a chuckle, not a smirk, a real, deep, genuine laugh. Elena froze. She had never seen him like this before. Relaxed, almost. Human. "What?" he asked, noticing her staring. "Nothing," she said quickly, turning back to the book. But her heart was beating too fast, because for the first time she saw the man behind the billionaire, and she wasn't sure what to do with that. That night, the estate was hosting a charity gala. Elena had planned to stay in her room, but Emily convinced her to go downstairs. Just for a little while. So Elena found herself standing on the balcony, watching the elegantly dressed guests swirl in the ballroom below. She was about to leave when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Enjoying yourself?" She turned to see Alexander, looking as powerful as ever in a sharp black tuxedo. Elena swallowed. "Not really my scene." Alexander smirked. "Would you rather be eating peanut butter and pickles?" she gasped. "You remembered?" He stepped closer. "I remember everything. The way he said it, soft, intimate, sent warmth curling in her stomach. And then he did something unexpected. He held out his hand. "Dance with me." Elena's breath hitched. "What?" "You heard me." She hesitated. This was dangerous territory, but something in Alexander's gaze, a challenge, a softness, something unspoken, made her take his hand. He pulled her into a slow dance, his movements smooth and controlled. For the first time, Elena wasn't thinking about contracts or rules or obligations. For the first time, she just felt. And when Alexander's hand lingered against the small of her back, when his breath brushed against her ear as he whispered, "You're stronger than you think," Elena realized something terrifying. She was falling for him. Chapter 4. Lines begin to blur. Elena had been feeling strange all morning. Not the usual nausea or fatigue. Something different. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the small but unmistakable flutter beneath her skin. A gasp escaped her lips. Was that? Her heart pounded as she tried again. There it was. A tiny movement. A life stirring inside her. "Elena?" She turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway of the lounge, his usual composed expression softening when he saw her. Her lips trembled. I think I just felt one of them move. For a moment, Alexander didn't speak. He simply stared as if trying to process the enormity of the moment. Then something shifted in his face. He stepped forward, hesitated, and then, to her complete shock, knelt before her. "May I?" he asked, voice lower, more intimate than she had ever heard. Elena's breath hitched. This was dangerous territory, but she nodded. Slowly, Alexander placed his palm against her belly. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and then a tiny kick. Alexander sucked in a breath, his gray eyes widening in awe. For the first time since this arrangement started, Elena saw him vulnerable. "They're real," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Elena swallowed hard. Something shifted between them in that moment. And suddenly, the contract, the business arrangement, the rules, none of it felt as clear as before. Later that afternoon, Alexander had been unusually quiet. Elena could tell the baby's first movement had affected him, but she didn't push. Instead, she spent the day in the gardens, enjoying the rare peace, until the tranquility was shattered. "Elena, we have a problem," Rosalie, the maid, said as she rushed toward her. "Mr. Wolfe needs you inside. Now." Elena's stomach clenched. She hurried to the main hall where Alexander stood near his security team, his entire posture rigid with fury. "What's going on?" she asked. Alexander didn't look at her at first. Instead, he handed her a printed article. Her blood ran cold as she read the headline. "Billionaire Alexander Wolfe, hiding his heirs, secret surrogate identified as waitress Elena Carter." No. Elena's hands shook. There was a photo of her. Someone had taken it outside the estate. "I don't," she swallowed, panic rising. "How did they find out?" Alexander's jaw clenched. "Blackwood." The name sent a shiver down her spine. Alexander turned to his head of security. "I want the source of the leak found. No more mistakes." His fury was terrifying, and oddly, reassuring. He was furious because someone had exposed her, because he wanted to protect her. "Elena," Alexander said, turning to her now, "you're not leaving this estate without security. Not now, not ever." She bristled. "I won't be caged in." His eyes darkened. "It's not a cage. It's protection." Their gazes locked, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was fighting him because she truly wanted freedom, or because being under his protection made her feel something she wasn't ready to admit. Later that night, Elena couldn't sleep. The news article had sent her anxiety spiraling. Would this affect her siblings? Would Noah and Emily be harassed now? She stepped onto the balcony, wrapping her arms around herself. The night breeze was cool against her skin. "You should be resting." She turned sharply. Alexander stood at the balcony doors, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up. He looked different. Less like the ruthless CEO, more like a man. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. Alexander stepped forward, his gaze unreadable. "You're worried about them." She didn't have to ask who. He already knew. "Yes," she whispered. Alexander sighed, then, to her utter shock, he took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Her breath caught. "You don't have to be scared, Elena." His voice was low, intimate. "I won't let anything happen to you, or them." She swallowed. Why did he have to say things like that? "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Because I should have protected you better." The air between them shifted. She wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly he was inches away. His scent, rich, expensive, intoxicating, filled her senses. Her pulse pounded as his hand lifted, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Elena," he murmured, his voice a warning. Her lips parted. "Alexander." Their faces were too close. The tension was too thick. And then, a sharp knock on the door. They both jerked apart. Alexander's face hardened, his mask snapping back into place. "Come in," he said, his voice back to its usual cool tone. Harris entered, oblivious to the moment he had just ruined. "Sir, we have news about the leak." Alexander turned away, but not before Elena saw the frustration in his eyes. As he left, Elena pressed a trembling hand to her chest. What the hell just happened? The next morning, Elena was determined to clear her head, but that became impossible when Emily came running into the breakfast room, her phone in her hand. "Elena, look at this." Elena took the phone and nearly dropped it. It was a new headline. "Breaking, Alexander Wolfe announces engagement to surrogate Elena Carter." Her heart stopped. "What?" she whispered. Alexander entered the room just as she turned toward him, rage and shock flooding her veins. "What is this?" she demanded. Alexander met her gaze, completely unfazed. "Damage control." Her hands trembled. You told the world we're engaged? Without telling me?" His eyes were hard. "This is the only way to shut Blackwood down. If the world believes we're together, he can't challenge the baby's legitimacy." Elena's pulse raced. "You can't just—" "I can." And I did. She felt dizzy. Her entire world had just changed with one news article. This was a game to him, a business strategy. Then why, when she looked into his eyes, did she see something that wasn't cold calculation? Why did she see hesitation? Tension? Possession? "Elena," her breath caught. She didn't know what he was going to say. Didn't know if she wanted to hear it, because suddenly everything was different. And she had no idea what would happen next. Chapter 5. A Game That Feels Too Real. Elena paced the length of her room, heart pounding, as the news of her engagement to Alexander Wolfe spread like wildfire across every major media outlet. How could he do this? Her phone buzzed with a message from Maggie. "Elena, what is going on? You're engaged to a billionaire? Call me now!" Elena groaned and tossed the phone onto the bed. She didn't even know how to explain this to herself, let alone anyone else. Before she could calm down, a sharp knock on her door made her freeze. "Elena, Alexander." She took a deep breath, anger replacing confusion as she marched to the door and yanked it open. "You had no right," she hissed, keeping her voice low so Emily and Noah wouldn't hear. "You announced our engagement without even telling me?" Alexander leaned casually against the doorframe, unfazed by her fury. "I told you. It was necessary." Her fists clenched. "You keep saying that, but you never asked me what I thought about it." His eyes darkened. "Because this isn't about what you think, Elena. This is about protecting the children." She hated how rational he sounded. "And what happens next?" she demanded. "Do I have to wear a ring, plan a fake wedding, smile for the cameras while pretending to love a man who treats me like a business deal?" For the first time, Alexander faltered. Something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable. "I don't expect you to love me," he said, voice quieter than before. "But I do expect you to play your role. Can you do that?" Elena swallowed. Could she? She hated the idea of lying, but she couldn't deny the truth. This wasn't just about her. It was about 4 innocent lives. With a deep breath, she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Fine. I'll play along. But don't expect me to make this easy for you," Alexander smirked. "I wouldn't expect anything less." And for some reason, that made her stomach flip. 2 days later, Elena found herself standing next to Alexander at a high-profile charity gala in downtown Manhattan. Photographers flashed their cameras. Reporters whispered about the mystery woman who had captured Alexander Wolfe's heart. If only they knew the truth. Elena had been given a stunning navy blue evening gown, and Rosalie had spent hours styling her hair into elegant waves. She barely recognized herself. Beside her, Alexander looked as effortlessly powerful as ever in a classic black tuxedo. "Smile," he murmured, his hand settling on her waist. Elena stiffened at the touch. It felt too real, too natural. But she did as he said, plastering a smile on her face as the cameras snapped away. "You two look stunning," one reporter gushed. "How did you meet?" Alexander, ever the master of deception, answered smoothly. "It was fate." Elena barely stopped herself from rolling her eyes. As the questions continued, Alexander leaned in close. Too close. His breath brushed against her ear. "Relax," he whispered. "The more believable we are, the sooner Blackwood backs off." Elena's skin tingled where his lips almost touched her. She hated how her body reacted to him. As the night wore on, Elena found herself seated at a VIP table while Alexander handled business. But just as she started to enjoy her dessert, a tall, stunning blonde in a designer dress approached her. "Enjoying your new life, Miss Carter," the woman drawled. Elena frowned. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The blonde smirked. "I'm Isabel Sterling. I was Alexander's last serious relationship." Elena's stomach dropped. "Oh," she said, schooling her features. "Nice to meet you." Isabel sipped her wine, eyes gleaming with mischief. "I must say I'm surprised. Alexander never struck me as the love-at-first-sight type. But here you are, the woman who tamed the wolf." Elena forced a polite smile. "I wouldn't say that." Isabel leaned in slightly. "Let me give you a little advice. Alexander doesn't love. He plays games. And when he gets bored, he moves on." Elena's chest tightened. She wanted to tell Isabel she was wrong, that this was different. But was it? Before she could respond, a strong arm slid around her waist. "Elena," Alexander's deep voice rumbled. "Is Isabel bothering you?" Elena's breath caught as Alexander pulled her closer. His grip was possessive, protective. Isabel smirked. "Not at all. We were just talking about you." Alexander's jaw tensed. "Then I'm sure the conversation was a waste of time." Isabel chuckled. "Always so charming." She turned back to Elena. "Good luck, dear. You'll need it." As she walked away, Elena realized something shocking. Alexander was still holding her. She looked up at him. "What was that?" His gaze was unreadable. "Isabel likes to cause trouble." "That's not what I meant," she said, heart hammering. You pulled me closer." "Why?" A muscle ticked in his jaw. "I didn't like the way she was talking to you." Elena's breath hitched. "Was that jealousy?" Before she could push further, Alexander abruptly let go. "Let's go home," he said gruffly, walking ahead. Elena watched him go, her emotions a tangled mess. What just happened? And more importantly, why did it feel like the lines between them were beginning to blur? Later that night, Elena stepped onto the balcony of the estate, trying to process everything. Alexander had been quiet since they left the gala, but now he stood behind her once again. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Elena turned to face him. For once, he wasn't guarded, and that scared her more than anything. "You say that," she whispered. "But what happens when this engagement is over? When the babies are born?" Alexander's expression darkened. "I don't know." Her heart clenched. Because neither did she. And for the first time, the game they were playing didn't feel like a game anymore. It felt terrifyingly real. Chapter 6. A Dangerous Game of Hearts. The morning after the gala, Elena Carter awoke with a strange sensation curling in her chest. Something had changed. The way Alexander had pulled her close, the possessiveness in his touch, the raw emotion in his eyes, it was dangerous, because she wasn't supposed to feel anything. This was a contract, a business arrangement, nothing more. But why then did she still feel the ghost of his hand on her waist? She was still lost in her thoughts when a soft knock sounded at her door. "Elena," Alexander's deep voice came through the wood. Her stomach tightened. They hadn't spoken since last night. She took a steadying breath before opening the door. Alexander stood there, dressed in his usual impeccably tailored suit, but something in his posture was different. He looked tense, as if something was bothering him. "I need you to come with me," he said. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Where?" "Doctor's appointment," he answered smoothly. "The twins need a checkup." She bit her lip. "Quadruplets," she corrected. Alexander exhaled, shaking his head. "Right, 4. I keep forgetting I'm going to be outnumbered." To her surprise, Elena laughed. It was unexpected, this moment of lightness between them. And when she looked up, she found Alexander staring at her, something unreadable in his stormy gray eyes. "Elena," he said softly. Her heart pounded. But before he could say anything more, his phone buzzed. His face hardened when he saw the name on the screen. Vincent Blackwood. Elena's stomach turned. Something was wrong. The drive to the doctor's office was silent. Alexander was on edge. Elena could feel it. The tight grip on the steering wheel, the way his jaw clenched whenever his phone buzzed. "Alexander," she finally said. "What's going on?" He hesitated, his hands flexing. Then he finally looked at her. "Blackwood is getting desperate," he admitted. "Has trying to find a way to claim the children." Elena's blood ran cold. "But the contract has found a loophole," Alexander said darkly. "Has trying to prove you're unfit to be the mother." Her breath caught. "That's ridiculous." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Has filed a motion to investigate you. He wants to prove that you're incapable of carrying my heirs." Elena felt sick. "How?" Alexander hesitated. "He's planning to dig into your past, find anything, your financial struggles, your jobs, anything that could make you look unstable." Elena clenched her fists. She had worked so hard to protect her siblings, and now this? She looked up at him, eyes blazing. "And what are you going to do about it?" Alexander's expression darkened. "Whatever it takes." Despite the tension, the doctor's appointment proceeded as planned. Elena lay on the exam table, her heart racing as the ultrasound machine hummed to life. The doctor smiled. "The babies are doing great." "Want to hear their heartbeats?" Elena nodded, glancing at Alexander. His face was unreadable, but when the first tiny heartbeat echoed through the room, something in his eyes changed. Then the second heartbeat, the third, and the fourth. Elena turned her head to look at him. For the first time, he looked truly shaken. His gaze dropped to her belly, as if finally understanding that these weren't just heirs. They were his children. "They're strong," the doctor said. Alexander swallowed. "They are." Elena's heart pounded. Something had shifted. In him, in her, in both of them, and she wasn't sure what that meant. That night, Elena found herself unable to sleep. She stepped onto the balcony, wrapping her arms around herself. It wasn't long before she sensed him behind her. "You're thinking too much," Alexander murmured. She turned to face him. "So are you." Their eyes met, the city lights reflecting in his stormy gray gaze. "Alexander," she whispered, "why are you really doing all of this?" He hesitated. Then, for the first time, he told her the truth. "When I was young," he said quietly, "I watched my mother struggle. My father was a powerful man, but he never loved her. She was just an obligation to him, and when she died, he didn't even shed a tear." Elena's chest tightened. "I swore I would never be like him," Alexander continued. "I swore I would never let emotions make me weak." Elena swallowed hard. "And yet," he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "And yet," he murmured, "when I saw you with my siblings at the gala, when I felt one of our babies kick, I realized something." Her breath caught. Alexander's gaze dropped to her lips. "I don't want to be like him." Her heart slammed against her ribs. He was so close, too close. "Elena," he whispered, "this was dangerous. This was not supposed to happen." But before either of them could move, a gunshot rang out. Elena barely had time to react before Alexander grabbed her, pulling her down to the floor. "Stay down," he ordered, his body shielding hers. Chaos erupted as security flooded the estate. Elena's mind was spinning. "What?" "Blackwood," Alexander growled. "He sent someone." Elena's blood turned to ice. "I need you to stay here," Alexander said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Do not move until I come back." "No," Elena grabbed his wrist. "Don't go out there. It's not safe." Alexander turned to her, and for the first time she saw something raw in his eyes. "I have to protect you." Elena's breath hitched. It wasn't about the babies anymore. He was protecting her. Before she could process it, he was gone, and Elena was left alone, heart racing as she realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't just about duty for him anymore, and it wasn't just business for her either. She was falling for him. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point. The estate was in chaos. Elena sat on the couch in the study, her hands trembling as she clutched a blanket around her shoulders. She could still hear the echo of the gunshot in her head. Alexander had left to handle security, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Her fear. This wasn't just about business anymore. She was in danger. The door swung open. Alexander walked in, his face like stone. She shot to her feet. "What happened? Are you okay?" His eyes scanned her, as if checking for any injuries himself. Then, without a word, he strode toward her. "Elena," he said, voice rough, "were you hurt?" She shook her head, but her body betrayed her. She was shaking. To her shock, Alexander reached out and pulled her into his arms. The breath rushed out of her. "Alexander, you could have been killed." His grip tightened. "I should have had more security, should have stopped this before it got this far." Elena swallowed hard. This was not the controlled billionaire she had come to know. This was a man on the edge, and he was holding her like he never wanted to let go. For a moment, she let herself melt into him. Just for a moment. After the security team swept the estate, Alexander led her to his private office. She sat down, arms crossed. "I want to know what's really going on." He leaned against his desk, his gray eyes unreadable. "Blackwood has crossed a line." "Clearly," she said, voice laced with sarcasm. Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line. "He won't stop." A shiver ran down her spine. "You mean hell keep coming after me?" Alexander's fists clenched. "Yes." The silence was deafening. She wasn't just a surrogate anymore. She was a weakness. Elena swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Alexander exhaled sharply. "We end this, for good." There was something final in his tone, and for the first time she wondered just how far he would go to protect her. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She paced the balcony, staring out at the darkened city. Then, as if drawn by something she didn't understand, she knocked on Alexander's bedroom door. A pause. Then the door opened. Alexander stood there, shirtless, his powerful chest and sculpted arms visible beneath the dim lighting. Her throat went dry. "Elena," he murmured, his voice husky. She swallowed. I can't sleep." Something flickered in his gaze. "Neither can I." She hesitated. Then, against her better judgment, she stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind her. Silence stretched between them. And then Alexander reached out. His fingers brushed against her cheek. Elena's breath hitched. "What are we doing?" she whispered. His hand dropped to her waist, his touch searing through the silk of her nightgown. "I don't know," he admitted. And then, his lips were inches from hers, a breath away, one move, and everything would change. But before they could cross that line, his phone buzzed. The moment shattered. Alexander exhaled sharply and pulled away, raking a hand through his hair. Elena's heart pounded. What just happened? "Go back to bed," he said roughly. She hesitated. Then finally she turned and walked out. But the damage was already done, because whatever was between them, it was real, and neither of them could deny it anymore. The next morning, Elena woke up to the news. Her phone buzzed with messages. She frowned and clicked on a link. Breaking. Blackwood Industries raided by FBI. Her breath caught. She turned on the TV. Vincent Blackwood has been formally charged with financial fraud, corporate espionage, and multiple violations of federal law. Her stomach twisted. She barely had time to process it when Alexander walked in. "You did this," she said, looking at him in shock. His expression was unreadable. "I handled it." Elena stood. "You took down an entire empire overnight." A shadow crossed his face. "I told you, I'd protect you." Her pulse raced. "What does this mean?" Alexander exhaled. "It means he won't be coming after you again." She should feel relieved, but all she could feel was fear, because Alexander had done all of this for her. Later that evening, Elena found Alexander in his office. He was pouring himself a drink, his posture tense. She hesitated. Then she walked inside and closed the door. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly. Alexander didn't look at her. "Because I had to." "No." She took a step closer. "You didn't have to. You wanted to." His grip on his glass tightened. "Elena, look at me," she whispered. Slowly, he turned, and when their eyes met, everything broke. Elena surged forward. Alexander met her halfway. His lips crashed against hers. It wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was raw. Desperate. Consuming. Her fingers tangled in his hair. His hands roamed her body, gripping her like he couldn't bear to let go. And then, he lifted her, placing her on his desk. "Elena," he murmured against her lips, "tell me to stop." She didn't, because she didn't want him to. And when he kissed her again, she knew there was no turning back. Chapter 8. The line has been crossed. Elena woke up feeling different. The weight of last night, the heat of Alexander's hands, the possessiveness of his kiss, the way he whispered her name like a prayer, still clung to her skin. She had never meant for it to happen, but it had, and now everything was different. She turned her head, expecting to see him beside her, but the bed was empty. Her stomach twisted. Alexander Wolfe, the man who always took control, who never let his guard down, had disappeared the moment the sun rose. She sat up, pulling the sheets around her, heart pounding. What did this mean? What if? It meant nothing to him. Before she could spiral further, a knock sounded at the door. Elena. She closed her eyes. Alexander. Taking a breath, she stood, grabbed her robe, and opened the door. He stood there, already dressed in his impeccably tailored suit, looking every bit the untouchable billionaire again. But his eyes, they weren't as cold as they used to be. "We need to talk," he said. Elena swallowed. "Yeah, we do." Alexander led her to his study, where the tension between them was suffocating. He leaned against the desk, arms crossed, like he was bracing for battle. Elena stood in front of him, refusing to let him intimidate her. "What happened last night?" he started. "Was real," she finished, eyes locked onto his. His jaw clenched. It was a mistake. Her breath hitched. Of course, she had let herself believe something impossible. She folded her arms, her voice hard. "A mistake? Or just inconvenient for you?" Alexander exhaled sharply. "Elena, whatever this is, it wasn't supposed to happen." She forced out a bitter laugh. "Right, because I'm just a surrogate, just a deal you made." His gray eyes flashed. "That's not what I meant." "Then what do you mean, Alexander?" she challenged. "Because last night, it didn't feel like business. It felt like something else." His hands clenched into fists, like he was holding something back. But then, his face shuddered. "We can't do this," he said, voice emotionless. "It complicates everything." Elena felt like he had just slapped her. That was it, then. She was nothing more than an inconvenience, and she had been a fool to think otherwise. Her chest ached, but she refused to show it. Instead, she lifted her chin. "Fine," she said. "You want to pretend last night never happened? Consider it erased." Then she turned and walked away, not looking back. The next few days were hell. Elena avoided Alexander at all costs. She spent time with Emily and Noah, went to her doctor's appointments alone, and did everything in her power to forget the way he had touched her. But forgetting Alexander Wolfe? Impossible. Because every time she saw him, his gaze lingered a second too long. Every time they were in the same room, the air felt thick with everything left unsaid. And worst of all, she could tell he was suffering too. But he refused to acknowledge it. He buried himself in work, acting as if nothing had changed. And that hurt more than anything. One evening, Elena found herself in the library, staring blankly at a book she wasn't really reading. She needed space, time to think. But just as she was about to leave, the doors swung open. Alexander. Their eyes met, and something snapped. "Elena," he started, voice tense. She slammed the book shut. "Don't," he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, he looked restless, uncertain. "Elena," he said again, stepping forward. She took a step back. "No, you don't get to do this," he frowned. "Do what?" "Act like last night meant nothing," she shot back. "Like you didn't feel it, too." His jaw clenched. "I'm trying to protect you." "From what?" she demanded, his hands curled into fists. "From me." The words hung between them. Heavy. Elena's heart pounded. And then, before she could stop herself, she marched toward him. "Let me make something clear, Alexander," she whispered, standing inches from him. "I don't need your protection, I need the truth." He sucked in a sharp breath. And then he shattered. His hands gripped her waist, yanking her against him, and then his mouth crashed against hers. Elena gasped. The world tilted. His kiss was rough, desperate, as if he had spent every second of the past few days trying to resist this. She melted into him, her fingers tangling in his hair. It wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was a war. A battle of emotions they had both tried to ignore. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. His breath was ragged. "I tried to stay away," Elena swallowed, then stopped trying. His eyes burned into hers, like he was finally seeing her. And just like that, everything changed. Just as the moment settled, Alexander's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his face instantly darkening. "Elena," he said carefully, "you need to sit down." A chill ran down her spine. "What is it?" He hesitated before handing her his phone. She took it with shaky hands, and when she read the screen, her stomach dropped. Breaking news. Elena Carter's secret past exposed. Is she fit to be the mother of Wolfe heirs? Her throat went dry. Beneath the headline were photos of her old apartment, her bank records, and worst of all, her siblings' private information. Her legs nearly gave out. I don't understand," she whispered. "Who?" Alexander's face was pure rage. "Blackwood." Her heart pounded. "He's trying to ruin me." Alexander clenched his jaw. "No, he's trying to take the babies." The room spun. "No," she breathed. "He can't." "He's filed a legal motion," Alexander said darkly. "He's claiming you're unfit to be their mother, that I should take full custody." Her hands trembled. She was going to lose them, her babies, her family, her entire world. Tears burned her eyes. "What do we do?" Alexander's gaze darkened, and when he spoke, it was a promise. "We fight." Elena swallowed hard, because this time it wasn't just about their arrangement, it was about everything. And for the first time she realized, Alexander wasn't just fighting for the children, he was fighting for her. Chapter 9. The Fight for Everything. Elena sat in the grand library of the Wolfe estate, her fingers trembling as she clutched the news article. Her past had been laid bare for the world to see. Her struggles, her debt, her failures, and worst of all, her siblings' private information. Tears burned behind her eyes. How had it come to this? A deep, steady voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Elena." She looked up to see Alexander standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his gray eyes unreadable, but she could see the anger simmering beneath his control. He strode toward her, his presence filling the room. "You don't need to read that trash." Elena swallowed hard. "It's not trash if it's true." His expression darkened. "It's a weapon, one Blackwood is using to take the children from you." Her breath caught. The babies. She placed a protective hand on her belly. "He can't take them. He has no right." Alexander's jaw clenched. "He's making a legal case. He's claiming you're financially and emotionally unstable, unfit to be their mother." Her stomach twisted. "This is insane. You know me. You know I'd do anything for these babies." Alexander took a step closer. "I do know that," he said, his voice low. "And that's why we're going to stop him." Her pulse pounded. "How?" Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line. "We get married." Elena blinked. "What?" "You heard me." Alexander's voice was calm, What? But his eyes burned with determination. If we get married, Blackwood's case crumbles. He's trying to prove you're unfit, but as my wife, that argument dies instantly. Elena's stomach flipped. Marriage. With Alexander Wolfe. She shook her head. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious in my life. She let out a sharp laugh. You don't even believe in love, Alexander, and now you're proposing? His jaw tightened. This isn't about love. This is about power, protection, and making sure our children stay exactly where they belong. Her heart pounded. She knew it made sense. Knew it was the smartest move. But then why did it terrify her? Say yes, Alexander murmured, his voice like a command. Elena exhaled shakily, and then, before she could stop herself, she whispered, yes. Within hours, the news broke. Alexander Wolfe, engaged to surrogate. Billionaire and future wife fight for custody of their 4 heirs. Paparazzi swarmed the estate gates. The media had a field day, calling it a scandalous love story. But the reality? It was war. Elena sat in the study as Alexander's lawyer, Richard Alcott, laid out the strategy. Blackwood will challenge the legitimacy of this engagement, Richard warned. Hell say it's a stunt. Alexander's face was pure steel. Then, well, make sure it isn't. Richard hesitated. Meaning? Alexander turned to Elena. We need to convince the world this is real. Her stomach twisted. How? His answer was simple. We move in together. We act like a real couple. And at the wedding, his eyes darkened. We make it undeniable. Later that night, Elena stood frozen at the entrance of Alexander's master bedroom. Her bags had been brought in. The bed was enormous, too big, too intimate. Alexander leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. You can take the left side. She scoffed. Oh, how generous of you, his lips twitched. Would you rather I slept on the floor? Elena rolled her eyes. I'd rather not be in this room at all. Alexander sighed and walked toward her, stopping inches from her. Elena, he murmured. She swallowed hard. His voice did dangerous things to her. This is temporary, he continued. But until this is over, we have to be convincing. She forced herself to nod. Fine, Alexander smirked, and then, without warning, he reached for the buttons on his shirt. Her breath hitched. What are you doing? He shrugged. Getting ready for bed. She spun away, cheeks burning. You could warn me. She heard him chuckle, and it was the most dangerous sound she had ever heard. As the days passed, the act became more real. Alexander touched her in public, kissed her just long enough for cameras to capture it. But when they were alone, something undeniable burned between them. One night, after yet another public event, they returned to the estate. Elena kicked off her heels, sighing. If I have to smile one more time, I'm going to scream. Alexander smirked, loosening his tie. Welcome to my world. She turned to face him. Why do you do it? His smirk faded. I built my empire from nothing, he said. And in my world, power is everything. If you don't have it, you're a pawn. Her heart pounded. And what about me? Am I just another pawn? Alexander stepped closer. His gaze dropped to her lips. You were. Her breath caught. But not anymore, he murmured. And then he kissed her. This time, it wasn't for the cameras. It wasn't for the media. It was for them. And Elena was terrified, because this time, she kissed him back. The next morning, everything changed. Elena and Alexander were having breakfast when Richard stormed in. You need to see this, he said, handing Alexander a legal document. Alexander's face turned to stone as he read it. Elena's stomach twisted. What is it? Alexander slowly placed the document on the table. Elena, he said, voice dangerously low. She swallowed. Yes. His gray eyes locked onto hers. Blackwood is suing for full custody, he said. Her blood ran cold. But we're getting married. The case should be... He's challenging our entire engagement, Alexander cut in. He's claiming it's all fake. Elena's heart stopped. He knew. He knew this was just a legal move. And now? Now they were in real danger. What do we do? She whispered. Alexander exhaled. And then he did the last thing she expected. He dropped to one knee. Elena Carter, he murmured, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a ring. Her breath caught. Alexander, his voice was pure steel. If we're going to win this, his gray eyes burned into hers. Then we make it real. Elena's heart pounded, because this time it wasn't just a strategy, and they both knew it. Chapter 10, When Love Wins Everything. Elena's heart stopped as she stared down at Alexander Wolfe, the billionaire, the man who had turned her world upside down, the father of the children she carried. On one knee, in his hand was a ring, a stunning, breathtaking diamond catching the golden morning light. But it wasn't the ring that made her breath hitch. it was the man. Because for the first time, Alexander wasn't in control. He wasn't the powerful, untouchable CEO. He was just a man who was asking her to stay. Elena, he murmured, his gray eyes burning into hers, her pulse pounded. Was this real? She swallowed hard. You don't have to do this, Alexander. His jaw tightened. Yes, I do. Elena took a shaky breath. This started as an arrangement, a legal strategy, but if you're proposing just to... I'm not. His voice was rough, raw, and when he reached for her hand, something in her shattered. I told you once that I don't love, he murmured, thumb brushing against her skin. That I don't believe in it, that I don't let people in. Her chest ached. I remember, his grip tightened. I was wrong, Elena stilled. Alexander's gaze darkened. Because somehow, without meaning to, without wanting to, I let you in. Her breath caught. I don't want to marry you because of Blackwood, he said. I want to marry you because I can't imagine my life without you. Tears burned her eyes. Alexander, I want you in my world, he murmured, standing now, tilting her chin up. I want you in my bed. I want you by my side. I want to raise these babies with you, protect you, fight for you, because you are mine, Elena, and I don't ever want to let you go. A tear slipped down her cheek. This wasn't business anymore. This was everything. She let out a trembling laugh. You're a stubborn man, Alexander Wolfe. A rare smile touched his lips. You bring it out in me. She exhaled shakily. And then she whispered the only answer that had ever been possible. Yes, the world had never seen a wedding like this. Every news outlet covered the event. The billionaire who had finally fallen in love, the unexpected romance, the grand love story. But to Elena, none of it mattered. Not the cameras, not the reporters. Only him. She stood in front of the mirror, dressed in a gown that fit her like a dream. A soft, elegant white, hugging her growing belly, draping in delicate lace. Emily adjusted her veil, beaming. You look like a princess. Elena let out a shaky laugh. I feel like I'm dreaming. Emily took her hands. This is real. He loves you. I can see it. Elena's heart swelled, because she knew it too. A knock at the door. Rosalie peeked in. It's time. Elena took a deep breath and walked toward her forever. Alexander stood at the altar, dressed in a black tux, looking every inch the powerful, devastatingly handsome man she had fallen for. But his eyes, those stormy gray eyes, held something new, something undeniable. Love. As she walked toward him, everything else faded away. It was just them. His hand reached for hers, strong and sure, and when she met his gaze, the rest of the world disappeared. The officiant spoke, but she barely heard the words. Until, do you, Alexander Wolfe, take Elena Carter to be your wife? Alexander's eyes never left hers. His fingers tightened around hers. I do. Her breath hitched. Then the officiant turned to her. And do you, Elena Carter, take Alexander Wolfe to be your husband? Tears burned behind her eyes. I do. A deep exhale left Alexander's chest, relief, happiness, something more. And then he kissed her. It wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was a promise, a vow. And in that moment, love won. 2 days after the wedding, Alexander took Blackwood down. The lawsuit crumbled. The courts ruled in Alexander and Elena's favor. They were a family now, legally untouchable. Blackwood's company collapsed, scandal consuming him. He had lost, and Alexander had won. But for once, he didn't care about the victory, because his greatest win was waiting for him at home. A month later, Elena woke to soft kisses against her shoulder. She smiled sleepily. Alexander, his arms tightened around her, his breath warm against her skin. Say it again, she laughed. What? My name. I like how it sounds when you say it. Her heart melted. She turned in his arms, pressing her forehead to his. You're ridiculous, she murmured. And you're my wife, he murmured back, kissing her deeply. She sighed into him, happiness filling her chest. The world had tried to tear them apart, but love had won. And now they had forever. The end. Epilogue, 1 year later, 4 little wolves. The estate was filled with laughter. Elena stood in the nursery, rocking one of the quadruplets in her arms, while 3 more squirmed in their cribs. A deep chuckle filled the air. She turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, arms crossed, a soft smile on his lips. You look beautiful like this, he murmured. Elena rolled her eyes. Covered in spit-up, his smirk deepened. Carrying my name, raising my children, being mine. Warmth spread through her chest. She stepped toward him, placing their son in his arms. Alexander held the baby with a gentleness that would have once been unthinkable, and then he met her gaze. I never thought I'd have this, he admitted. A family, love, you. Elena's heart swelled. "You do now," she whispered. His arms wrapped around her, and as their children cooed and the sun bathed their world in golden light,